Hello, everyone. I'm Liz Wishnick, Senior Research Scholar here at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and a Senior Research Scientist at CNA. It's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Gill, Executive Director of Asia Society's Policy Institute Center for China Analysis, a very lengthy title, to talk about his latest book on Xi Jinping, Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping. Before I introduce Dr. Gill, I'd just like to thank the Weatherhead East Asian Institute for sponsoring this event, along with the program on China and the world, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Study Center here at Columbia, and China Global Centers, Beijing. So we're so pleased that Dr. Gill could find time to talk with us. Prior to joining the Asia Society, he held a number of research and academic leadership positions on the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the United States, in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the United States. Most recently, he was professor and chair of the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Montclair University in Sydney, and was also the inaugural scholar in residence with the Asia Society Australia. In previous roles, he served as director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, as the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and as the founding director of the Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies at Brookings. Dr. Gill serves on the Board of Governors of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore and the Board of Advisors of the National Bureau of Asian Research, and is a Senior Associate Fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, London. So he is also the author, editor of 9 books on China and Asia-related topics. His most recent book, the one that he's going to discuss with us, Daring to Struggle, was published in 2022 by Oxford University Press. Dr. Gill received his PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia, and he lived and worked in China and Taiwan for 3 years and has made more than 60 working visits to China. He received the Royal Order of the Commander of the Polar Star, the highest award bestowed on foreigners by the Swedish monarch for his contributions to Swedish. So, Dr. Gill, the floor is yours.
Great.
Dr. Gill will speak for about half an hour, and then we will break for Q&A, and we also invite the online audience to submit questions in the Q&A. I will moderate.
Great. Professor Wishnick, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I was thinking to myself, when was the first time I'd ever been in this citadel to higher learning in the international relations field? And I don't know if anybody in the room recalls Stephanie Newman, Professor Stephanie Newman, who was a real powerhouse here working in international security affairs. And when I was just wrapping up my dissertation and starting out my career, she was an enormous help to me in getting some of my first publications a little bit of attention on the issue of Chinese arms trade, Chinese arms export. So it's a wonderful opportunity. I've been back many, many other times, but I was just thinking about that today. So it's a great chance for me to be able to come back and be with you. I want to also extend my gratitude to the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, to all the other Columbia University affiliated sponsors and supporters of tonight's event, and extend a special thanks to everyone here in the room. I know it's been a busy week for a lot of you last week and beginning already this week with events and so on. So it's a wonderful chance to be able to see you, even though I know you probably have a lot of other things you'd like to be doing. Also a special shout out to my friend and in many ways mentor, Tom Christensen, thank you very much for you being here as well and for helping facilitate the opportunity this evening. So I want to talk about this book, Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping. It came out last year with Oxford University Press. And it was an attempt to look back on 10 years of Xi Jinping's leadership and what changes have come about as a result of that, especially in terms of China's international relations. And of course, knowing full well in 2022 that we should have every expectation that Xi Jinping will be with us for many, many more years to come, it was also an opportunity to take stock of his approach in his first 10 years in power and to try to discern what that might mean for the next period of his leadership going forward. I wanted to write a book, though, that wasn't overly academic. I felt it was important that we try to make the book as accessible as possible to a wide audience. And so I'm hopeful it's not too dense and academic. My family, you know, that still wonders what it is I actually do for a living, had the comment, there's a lot of information in there, a lot of data. Yeah, I guess it is. So if you're into China, obviously, you know, everything all right? I'm sorry. Right. Still in. Trying to make the book accessible then to a wider audience, you know, of students, of scholars. I hope my scholarly colleagues find the book worthwhile and interesting, but even a broader audience, even of informed citizens who may not be China specialists, but who could find this book valuable, and at least getting them up to speed on very key developments, fully aware that China is obviously going to have a larger and larger impact on our lives going forward, for better and for worse. But then, you know, the question was, you know, how to organize the book. There we go. But how to organize the book. And of course, you know, there's lots of ways of going about that. Some persons who would take a look at this topic of China's foreign policy might devote a chapter to relations with Japan, chapter to relations in Southeast Asia, chapter to relations with Russia, a chapter to other regional parts of the world, the United States, etc. Or maybe they'd organize it by function. You know, what's China's approach to global climate issues? What's China's approach to international security, to non-proliferation, to international development aid, etc. And those are perfectly valid ways to approach the book. But I felt that neither one of those would completely capture what I was trying to capture, and that was to reduce that complexity of China's approach to the world under Xi Jinping into some relatively simple construct or rubric that people could remember, but that would also sort of portray China's approach to the world in a way that makes sense. And I came up with this idea to do it in the form of a Venn diagram, to try and condense this complexity to a reasonable number of baskets or reasonable number of what I call motivations or drivers for what China wants in the world, and do it in a way that's at least graphically coherent and expresses certain key elements of China's approach to the world. So here you see this graphic. It represents, you know, 6 key drivers that I've identified as being most important for China in its relationships with the outside world. And of course, this could have 10 different baskets. You could have innumerable amounts. I've seen other authors break it down to just simply 3. You know, my boss, Kevin Rudd, has identified 10 or 12. You know, so there's different ways of doing this. This is the way I thought it was going to be best. And these 6 drivers of in relative rank of priority in my mind, legitimacy, sovereignty, wealth, power, leadership, and ideas. But importantly, this graphic also represents another important element, and that is, that these 6 drivers of China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping are not standalone. They overlap with one another. They gain synergies from one another. One supports the other, or 2 support 2 others. In other words, they are often synergistic and overlapping with one another. And a second element of this graphic that is important is that the number 1 driver for China's engagement with the international community is at the very center, where all of the various drivers most overlap, and that has to do with legitimacy, right? So that's sort of the construct. These form the 6 key chapters at the center of the book. And basically, what I do is I go through each of these, and I try to explain what I mean by these concepts or drivers, and then populate the remaining parts of the chapter with how that gets manifested in China's relations with the outside world. And then take stock at the end of the book about what this all might mean for China going forward and for China's relations with the world, as well as what the outside world should then do in response. Let me say one more caveat before getting into this a little more in depth. None of these are particularly new. And yes, I'll acknowledge right away that you could apply a similar construct probably to many, many other countries. My point here was to try to make it easier for people to understand and conceptualize developments inside China. But I think, in addition, make the argument that while maybe not all these elements are so new, what is new, of course, is under Xi Jinping in particular, a far greater degree of political will, ambition to pursue these goals in China's international relations. And secondly, not just greater political will, but obviously far greater capacity, far greater resources. So it's that combination of both political mandate and will with the capacity to pursue these goals, which I think is what makes the Xi Jinping era in international relations so interesting, and is going to continue to be interesting for us in the years ahead. So why don't I just rattle through these 6 elements very, very briefly here. What do I mean by legitimacy? And I claim this to be the most important objective driving PRC foreign policy. It means in your international engagements, making sure you're doing everything you can through them to maintain and bolster the legitimacy and even survival of the Chinese Communist Party. And, I'm not just making this up. I mean, you merely have to read Xi Jinping's own speeches in front of his diplomats and those tasked with engaging in the international community. So too, speeches from Yang Jiechi and on down, where China's representatives abroad are told that they must hold up as number 1 in all of their work the power and the legitimacy of the party is their number one task. I talk about this as being realized with 2 target audiences in mind. First, obviously, is the international audience. The other is the domestic audience. And arguably, it's that domestic audience which is often even more important than the international audience in driving home the message that China's international activities bolster and sustain the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. I would argue further that a small subset of the domestic audience in China is even more important, and that's the 95 to 100 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. They, too, are to be fully convinced and fully supportive of China's activities abroad, especially in the way that those activities help bolster and maintain the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. In the book, I talk about sort of 4 narratives which get expressed internationally that try to deliver that message of legitimacy, the ideological message, that is to say that, China is on the right side of history. China has correctly read the tides and trends of history. Is everything okay? Oh, okay. Oh, I see it. Let's see your slide.
Right.
Oh, it's burning. It's burning. The mirror imaging.
Three times.
They're working better. The first of these narratives is that China, the Chinese Communist Party has correctly assessed the tides of history, and that they are on the right side, and that China's future is basically determined by this correct reading. The agreed nationalist narrative that only the Chinese Communist Party could have saved China from the beratements and humiliations foisted upon them by foreign powers, and it brought China back to its rightful place, and that only the party is going to be able to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. There's the performance narrative, i.e., only the party would have been capable of delivering on the remarkable economic success story that China has experienced. And more recently, a kind of cultural narrative that only the party is in the right place to preserve, the great cultural achievements and legacies of the Chinese peoples. And while I would say that many of these messages are delivered at home, as I said before, because that's so important to maintain the legitimacy at home, so too these messages are broadcast increasingly abroad and have an impact on how China is perceived, for better and for worse, and that this messaging has increased under Xi Jinping's rule. So the goal here abroad, at least, is to seek to gain the acceptance, the appreciation, even the approbation of foreign governments and societies for China's governance system, for its domestic policies, and even for others to align more closely with China's overseas interests. So that's a key first element. Let's see if I can, there we go. Second, sovereignty. And when I talk about sovereignty in the book, I'm not really talking about what I would call a more narrow definition of sovereignty, that is to say, who owns what on which side of a disputed territorial line, but a broader, a more expansive understanding of sovereignty to protect what some would call China's growing strategic frontiers, and to gain greater room for maneuver in the international system for China's interests. In the book, I talk, about sort of the evolution of the notion of sovereignty within China over the past 150 years. Trying to make the case, I'm not the first to do this, but just to reinforce the case that in many respects, Beijing, as under the leadership of the Communist Party, has come to embrace Westphalian notions of sovereignty, even more enthusiastically than those countries of the West who have the historical legacy of the Westphalian system, precisely because an enthusiastic embrace of the Westphalian notions of sovereignty can be so protective in the principle of the Chinese Communist Party and what it can do inside of its own borders. But this enthusiasm for their more expansive definitions of China's sovereignty has a very, very deep impact on China's foreign policy, especially relationships with its neighbors, especially those with which it has disputed territorial claims. And we know where those regions are: the East and South China Seas, the Himalayas, Tibet. In the book, though, I argue that even internally contested sovereignty, I think most people in the world agree with the general conceived map of China, that it does include Tibet, it does include Xinjiang, It does include Hong Kong. But we also know that Chinese claims to sovereignty, even in those territories, are highly contested, both in some cases by governments external to China, like India and its views towards Tibet, or even within China. We know very well in Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong. Recent years, we've seen obvious evidence that Chinese claims to sovereignty, even internally, are highly contested. And all of these disputed and contested elements of China's sovereign claims have huge impact on how it operates within the international system. It creates, I think, increasingly enormous tensions with many of its key neighbors. It seems under Xi Jinping that this objective of asserting Chinese sovereignty, including in the broader sense of seeking to protect strategic frontiers, has become much sharper during the Xi Jinping era, and includes increasingly the coercive or inducive use of diplomatic and economic leverage. And I'll talk about this a little bit later in trying to assert those sovereign claims. Third, I turn to the issue of wealth as the third important objective in China's foreign policy pursuits. Why? Obviously, the pursuit of wealth helps generate national prosperity. That supports legitimacy of the party. It directly supports other objectives in China's foreign policy, such as the accretion of hard power, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Interestingly, China, more than many other emerging economies over the past 30, 40, 50 years, statistics suggest that China has been far, far more dependent on its relations with the outside world for the success of its development model. China is still far more dependent than many on access to external inputs to its economic success story, access to capital, access to foreign technologies, access to foreign know-how, and of course, access to foreign markets are very much a part of China's economic success story in its building of its wealth. And that has obvious implications for how China has pursued its foreign policy now and in the future. We know that China is now trying to seek to try to reduce some of that dependency. Decisions which were taken, I think, even before all of the Trumpian era and decoupling has become a buzzword for China's relations with the West. And I talk in the book about how that effort to try and reduce that dependency, which has traditionally been central to China's wealth generation, is likely to be problematic going forward. As I talked about before, pursuit of these different objectives overlap with one another. You gain synergies from them. And I think maybe that's no more true, perhaps, in how the pursuit of wealth and developing national prosperity has very important implications for the pursuit of power. The fourth important objective I talk about in the book. And here when I'm talking about power, I'm not talking about soft power. I get into that a little bit later when I get into the other objectives of leadership and ideas. I'm very explicit in the book. I'm talking about hard power, according to Joseph Nye's definition. That is, you either coerce through threats, alignments of others with your interests, or through inducements, carrots. You basically buy alignment from others in order to try to shape their decisions more in line with yours. And I think this is an aspect of China's foreign policy, which perhaps has been one of the most actively and assertively used among these 6 key objectives. And it's pretty obvious to understand why, because China's economic toolkit, its great economic heft and power, allows it to wield that power in coercive and inducive ways, increasingly in ways that it just could not in decades prior. in the chapter of the book, I give lots of examples of where we've seen the use of coercive and abusive economic and military hard power to try and get other countries to do China's bidding. I discussed, the various points of leverage which economic and military hard power can exercise with other countries, even including going into a lot of detail about China's military modernization and how that has been translated into hard power, especially towards China's nearest neighbors. And even I would argue increasingly is reshaping thinking even in the United States about how it will choose or not choose to engage with China militarily if it comes to that. So fourth, hard power. Fifth and sixth, I talk about leadership here and then ideas. And here I think we see a relatively new set of efforts, which I think have characterized the Xi Jinping, maybe differentiated in some ways, the Xi Jinping era from prior leaders in China and in their approach to the international system. Here, when I'm talking about leadership, I'm talking about making an effort to have a greater say in how the world works, diplomatically, economically, and even in the realm of technological advancement, all with the idea of trying to shape the system, shape the system in different ways that are more conducive to Chinese national interests. Under Xi, I think this effort has become far more prominent, and it does directly contribute to some of the other drivers that I talked about in the book, like legitimacy, sovereignty. And increasingly we see that China's pursuit of leadership in the international system is having a greater and greater impact, for better and for worse, I would argue, for China's relationships with the outside world. In trying to detail what I'm talking about in terms of leadership, I could talk about expanding contributions and leadership positions in the UN system, drawing heavily from the work of persons like Courtney Fung and Rosemary Foote to try and document and understand those activities, but also other international organizations, of course. I think it's fair to talk about Sinocentric multilateralism, in which China takes the lead to stand up and organize multilateral institutions outside of the UN system in order to have a greater say in how those organizations will operate, have a greater say in the decisions and allocation of resources that those organizations can convey. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is maybe one of the best examples of that, but there are lots of other smaller, lesser known examples. For example, just the effort last year that China undertook to try and create a kind of Sinocentric multilateralism in the Western Pacific. There was the effort underway, which has run into a good bit of trouble in recent years, the so-called 16+1 effort with Central European and Eastern European states, with China at the center. There was the recent China-Arab summit that took place just a few months ago, an interesting new development that I think we're going to see more and more investment on China's part to try and drive forward. In the book, I also get out of the sort of diplomatic and multilateral political world and also point out how China's investing a lot of resources in trying to take leadership across certain emerging technologies as a means to have a greater say on how standards are set within those technological realms, but also so that China can economically emerge as global leaders in these important technologies of the future. Then finally, I talk about ideas as an important pursuit for China's foreign policy. And by this, I mean promoting ideas and norms internationally that are more aligned with the interests of the Chinese Party state. Now, again, this is not necessarily new for China. Think of Maoism, for example. and it's long been a part, I think, or at least it's been an effort by the party to try and shape international thinking about China and about the party. But as I said before, under Xi Jinping, this has really gained a great deal more priority, a great deal more in the way of mandate, political mandate, to pursue this effort, and of course, a great deal more in the form of resources, money, being put behind the effort internationally. It's here in this part of the book that I give a good bit of attention to three important Chinese Communist Party organizations. Three of the 5 or 6 central bodies of the Chinese Communist Party: the propaganda department, the United Front Work Department, and the International Liaison Department, all of which have as a very important part of their mandate, and I would argue an increasingly important part of their mandate, to cultivate foreign elites, to, as Xi Jinping has said, tell China's story well, and to gain greater international narrative power. Or WEAI. Some people call that international discourse power. In other words, trying to find ways that China's voice and views are heard and heeded, more importantly, accepted as legitimate, and as part of the way that the international system should work. I identify what I call 4 big ideas. There are probably many more we could talk about. I think the party wants us to understand that we are in a new era, meaning that not only under the leadership of Xi Jinping, but a new era in which China will achieve its rejuvenation, and it will have its interests accepted and respected in the international system. Of course, we're all familiar with the phrase building a community of shared future for mankind, which sounds quite benign, but of course suggests, to me at least, that there is a greater commonality of purpose across the international community, which would by definition mean that the Chinese Communist Party is fully accepted and respected as a legitimate government and contributor to the international system. Unity with diversity is another important phrase. It draws from Confucian principles, but again, I think it means a world that is diverse is a stronger world, but it's one that has to be unified, again, accepting of that diversity. Another interesting idea that we hear increasingly, and I believe in just the past 3 or 4 months, we've heard a great deal more, from, for example, Xi Jinping's 20th Party Congress work report, also his recent speech to the Central Party School, where increasingly we are asked to understand that there is a Chinese solution or a Chinese model or Chinese wisdom, translated a lot of different ways for addressing global challenges. In other words, China has experiences, China has a wealth of ideas, ways of doing things politically, socioeconomically, and so on, that other countries might adopt. I'm not suggesting that China is proposing that the world emulate China, but rather in ways that we've not seen prior to Xi Jinping, an effort underway to try and hold up the Chinese socioeconomic and social political model as having potential for some to adopt, to see to their own development. So those are the 6 drivers I talked about. Those are the core elements of the book. So what? What does this tell us about what we can expect going forward? Well, I will telegraph my conclusions by saying that I think in pursuing these 6 ambitions, or pursuing these 6 goals, it's pretty clear to me that it's generating more and more contested environment for China, not just around its periphery, but in other parts of the world. Global public opinion, it's mixed, but I think it's clear, especially in the developed and democratic world, the public opinion towards China and even towards Xi himself is in decline. I'll say something that maybe won't sound controversial, but I'd be keen to be challenged. You can make the argument that the 10 years under Xi Jinping's leadership, China's major relationships have worsened around the world, not improved. On a net basis, is China better off in its foreign policy relationships today than it was before Xi Jinping became the leader? I think Xi Jinping himself would have to admit no. If you read his 20th Party Congress work report carefully, you know that he seems to be very concerned about what the international system looks like from China's perspective. And a part of the reason I'm arguing here is that the pursuit of these 6 fundamental aims increasingly has proven to run counter to the interests and values of many countries around the world. So, you talk about wolf warrior diplomacy, which may well be in some retreat now, but continued assertions of sovereignty, continued use of inducive and coercive hard power, economically and militarily, efforts to gain leadership and exercise so-called soft power efforts and promoting ideas conducive to party interests, I think are meeting with a fair bit of pushback in different parts of the world, and not just in the developed or democratic world. So what can we expect then? If that assessment is correct, what should we expect from the Chinese leadership going forward? Again, I'm not very optimistic. I think that, having staked their future on realizing this long wished for goal of national rejuvenation, and having identified these sorts of pursuits that I talk about in the book as being critical to that realization, I think it's highly unlikely that the PRC leadership would want to back down, and rather is more likely to double down, or as Xi Jinping likes to say repeatedly, Ganyu Dojeng, to dare to struggle, to dare to fight, to dare to fight and dare to win in this increasingly contested environment through the quest for legitimacy, sovereignty, wealth, power, leadership, and ideas. Now, it's possible, I think we could come up with a scenario maybe, whereby China's continued pursuit of these ambitions, even as they dare to struggle, could lead to a more constructive and beneficial relations with the PRC. It could give rise to a China that's increasingly prosperous and stable, just, and maybe even resolved to peacefully settling regional and global tensions. But I don't think even PRC leaders, let alone leaders around the world, believe that such positive outcomes are likely, and that instead, increasingly, I think the world and China have come to understand that a long struggle lies ahead for what China wants. So last slide here, what does that mean for the rest of us in the world as we enter this far more contested future? I don't devote a lot of time in the book to various, to reams of bullet points of specific policy recommendations. And I did not intend for this book to be for any particular government, like in Washington or elsewhere. So, these are pretty broad ideas, but I'd love to talk with you all about them. I think it's important that we continue to recognize China's strengths and its weaknesses. Strengths are very clear, but obviously, and as I try to identify in the book, not only is China facing headwinds internationally with some of its pursuits, but the very ability for China to continue to pursue those objectives also faces some serious headwinds at home for a variety of structural challenge, economic and demographic and other challenges that Beijing is facing. So understanding those weaknesses, I think, or vulnerabilities are equally and maybe even more important in helping us try to manage and stabilize the relationship with China going forward. I think governments around the world are increasingly coming to understand that they can gain some strengths in numbers and try to do what they can to resist the classic wedge tactics, which Beijing has been very successful at exercising in the past, to try and provide the potential of others to coalesce and counterbalance unwelcome elements of China's foreign policy. And I think we'll see more of that going forward. Obviously, nations around the world need to do a better job of building greater resilience internally in order to resist, push back, and protect themselves from, again, unwelcome elements of China's foreign policy, from economic coercion to military threats to misinformation and so on. Fourth, I think we need to be better prepared for a competition of ideas with China. I mentioned that ideas as that last major objective of China's foreign policy, and I think we need to take this far more seriously. China is quite serious about trying to promote many of its values and understandings of how the world should work and how domestic governance systems should work. And they are, I think, girding for a big fight on this. And, I'm not so sure we in the, let's say, democratic and advanced or more open parts of the world are fully prepared for that. And obviously we have flaws of our own that we need to be addressing to be better in this competition of ideas that is to come. Finally, in spite of all of those challenges we face, I think, in our relationship with China, I try to end the book on a somewhat positive note by making the point that for all of these difficulties, there are so many areas in which we're going to need to find a way to work with China if we're going to be addressing some of the major global challenges we face. And of course, you all know what those would be, from climate change to dealing with international criminal activity, non-proliferation, and many others, addressing the next pandemic. This is really important, and I know it can just come off as simple rhetoric, but and I'm unfortunately not all that optimistic. I mean, if our two countries, United States and China, couldn't even find a way to work together when millions upon millions of our own citizens were dying of a global pandemic, then, as I heard a friend of mine, a colleague at Age of Society, say today, I'm not sure even an alien invasion is something that our two countries are prepared to cooperate on. But nevertheless, all of us as scholars, as policy practitioners, policy advisors, I think we need to do everything we can, both here and in Beijing, to continue to press our representatives to be thinking in these terms. So that's my basic set of what we should try to do going forward, and in so doing, hopefully bring about a modicum of some stability and sustainability for the relationship with China going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gill, for that illuminating discussion of the book. It's really an excellent book. I read it. It's very readable and extremely substantive at the same time. And when we met in Sydney in August to discuss it, so many developments in China had not yet happened. And so I wanted to start off by, before we turn to the audience, by asking you about some of those developments. So we have the 20th Party Congress and the strange situation of Hu Jintao being let out of the room. Then we had the unexpected end of zero COVID. We had the balloon incident. And most recently, allegations that China might be contemplating lethal aid to Russia. So when you think of these recent happenings, does that change at all your assessment of Xi Jinping's will and capacity in terms of his grasp of the situation and his control over policy? There is a portrayal of him as a chairman of everything. And yet there seems to be these X elements. We wonder, is he maneuvering? Is this his responsibility, or is he not controlling the efforts of others and other agencies? How do we explain this seemingly bumpy road?
Well, I think one quick way to understand it is that just because you have power doesn't mean you know what you're doing. I mean, that's not uncommon in lots of different parts of the world. And so I think, misjudgment and overreach is common, especially among those who feel that they may be all powerful. So that may help explain what seem to be some mistakes or misplays, misjudgments. But do I think that they add up in a way that's going to alter this somewhat negative trajectory that I foresee or foresaw when I hit send on this book about almost exactly a year ago? No, it doesn't. I mean, I think, again, because of the stakes as the party leadership sees them, at least as long as Xi Jinping is at the top and continues to hold the kind of sway it appears he does over the sort of strategic direction of the party and the party's increasing intrusion, is that the word? Increasing ability and influence to shape government decision-making in China. I just don't see there being a big shift. So maybe what we're seeing are some tactical retreats, some tactical recalibrations, some obvious, it appears as if there's some rethinking about, how do we get the economy, back where it needs to be, but, which might entail, some loosening of the more statist approach that it seems Xi Jinping favors. But that all goes back to the same aim. It's a tactical shift, adjustment for reasons so you can pursue the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation even more forcefully at some later date, in the future. So maybe it's still too early to tell exactly, but reading what Xi Jinping says, reading how the party talks about its aims and how the party talks about its future, I don't think not much has changed, at least from a strategic point of view.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to go to the podium to look at the online questions and.
Sit down.
Okay. Yes. Ask question. First question.
Yeah, if I could ask a question. Can you hear me online if I speak at this volume? Now it's to be. Oh.
That's right here.
Oh, there's one there. Okay.
I think the book's great. I really enjoyed reading it yesterday, and I think you do a tremendous service by the organizational approach you took in the book. I want to press you on your last two slides on leadership and ideas, because there's a kind of debate going on out there. You know that I have previously argued, and I'm starting to wonder about my old argument, that the U.S.-China strategic competition will not look like a U.S.-Soviet Cold War, and for various reasons. And one of the reasons is that I don't see a China that's trying to use the words of the national security strategy or various officials in the US government. I don't see a China that's trying to revise or overthrow the international system as we know it, in the way that Mao did, in the way that Stalin did, in the way that the communist leadership in the first half of the Cold War did. And the second thing I don't see is I don't see a China that's trying to export its model actively and trying to encourage other countries to become less like the United States or less like liberal democracies and more like an authoritarian, centrally led state. Again, in the way that Mao did, in the way that Stalin did, in the way that the revolutionary communist leaders did. And your chapters on leadership and on ideas leave me wondering where you fit in that kind of debate, because on the one hand, you don't use the kind of strident language of China trying to overthrow the system. You talk about China trying to gain more voice in the existing system, more representation in existing international organizations, more diplomatic contacts in multilateral settings that maybe China helped create with the Arab states, et cetera. And on the ideas front, it seems like on most of your bullets on your ideas slide, it's mostly about convincing other countries that the Chinese Communist Party model at home is legitimate and shouldn't be criticized and attacked from the outside, rather than you, democratic Indonesia, should be more authoritarian, or you, democratic Japan, should be more authoritarian and less multi-party democracy. But then at the very end of your talk, when you talked about this struggle for ideas, it seemed more like the early part of the Cold War. You know, we need to bolster our democracy. We need to fight against authoritarianism. And I don't know what the right answer is. It's a very long presentation. I don't know what the right answer is. I'm struggling to know what the right answer is. And I'm of the opinion that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has dragged China into a more revisionist international position than it was before. And it might not be able to pull out of that, but that's a more recent event than most of the things you cover in the book.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the right answer is. And I just want to know your opinion, because you're really smart and you're really informed, and you might not have the same opinion as either myself or the national security strategy on what China's up to.
I probably fall in between. And I think one of the difficulties in answering the question squarely is that I see more movement in China's efforts to exert greater leadership, to make their ideas more widely heard and accepted, and to even not export the system globally, but to at least hold up the model to those who would care to embrace it, and they'd be more than happy to try and help. Various governments adopt or take on those sorts of models or ways of governance. So on the leadership side, what I think is interesting there is that it's not an attempt to dominate the world or to assert China as the global leader, but rather to work through the system, I think, in ways that can eke out incrementally agreements, arrangements, alignments with other countries that are more in tune with what China would like to see, less threat. I mean, so to create a world system that would be less threatening to it. I think I do quote directly, Jessica Chen Weiss's famous phrase, to make a world safe for autocracy.
Mhm.
I think I probably would align myself up with that type of thinking that what China's up to. On ideas, I think maybe that's where you and I might separate a little bit, because whereas China may not be openly and actively, or at least vocally leading with the notion that their ideas about governance should be adopted by others. In a sort of negative sense, but the flip side of the coin, they are openly and vocally, even vociferously saying, the democratic system's got it wrong. They've made a lot of mistakes. Look at the chaos that we see there. So, and sort of implicitly juxtaposing what the Chinese leadership remind us has been success story at home, relative stability, low crime, etc., vis-a-vis what we see in the democratic West. I mean, the very phraseology attributed to Xi Jinping is that the East is on the rise and the West is in decline. I mean, that's an ideological question at its heart, and it's not simply one of economic growth or economic decline. So I guess my point is that I think, at least on the ideas side, we are, I think, entering a phase. It's not like, I mean, if we're going to say we don't have to worry until it gets like Mao, then I think that's a very high bar. What we do see is something different from the past 40 years of China's approach to the world. And the question, I guess, is, does that become a larger and larger part of China's approach to the international community? Do they see this as an area where they need to sort of do battle, as it were, with us on ideas? And I think the evidence right now is yes.
Oh, thank you. Is the motivation there your legitimacy circle that they're presenting this position internationally about the weakness of democracy because Xi Jinping is afraid that there might be some Chinese who want to follow that model and hurt CCP legitimacy at home? Or is it that really believes this is the best model for humanity and he wants to sell it abroad? See, it's a simpler way of putting the question.
Right.
And I guess I like your book because it started out legitimacy for, and it was all about the Chinese Communist Party and its legitimacy at home and everything else fed off of that. But then I saw when you got into ideas and leadership, it started to spin into something else, which may be happening. You might be right. But if it's happening, it's very consequential.
Yes, it is. And it's hard to identify. But it's interesting, the way you phrase that's interesting, because I think the answer is yes to both.
Okay.
Why? Because I think you can make the sort of argument that at a very hard-nosed and sort of pragmatic level, obviously the party is going to do everything it can to protect itself. But I guess the question is, does Xi Jinping believe what he says when he talks about the tides of history and that Marx had it right and that China's on the right side? If he believes that, then the second point is true too.
Yeah.
That maybe it won't happen next week,
Mhm.
maybe it won't happen in 20 years, but it's going to happen. And if we just keep pursuing it, and we are in our ideology, our understanding of world history will prevail. That's what he's saying. Now the question is, do we believe it? Do we believe he believes it?
Yeah.
A question in the back, please come up and take the microphone.
Thank you very much. My first question is, during Mao's time, Maoism was against Confucian teachings, but now is there like a convergence of Maoism and, I mean, Marxism and Confucian thinking, which is like a different mode of thinking? And the second is, we don't usually talk about Made in China 1925 program that came up a few years ago. And I think it's related to what you talked about, the 6 prongs of what the Chinese are doing because they want to be superior in technology. And the US and the UK are trying to use India as a bet against China. And can you say a few words on how successful that might be and how China is using its R&D investment to promote the Made in China 2025, is it? 2125, yeah, 200 years back. Yeah, thank you. That's 200 years back.
Okay, well, those are good, both very, very good questions. Yes, I think there's an attempt, I think, in the modern day Chinese Communist Party to find a way to embrace and absorb and weave into the Communist Party mandate and leadership narrative elements of traditional Chinese culture. Not only to sort of, as I said before, sort of hold up the party as the rightful steward of that great tradition, and knowing full well how important that tradition is to Chinese people, but also even to draw from elements of it as a way of almost justifying or underscoring their legitimacy and forms of governance and rules within the society. So yes, there's definitely an attempt to do that. I can't say that I'm following it all that closely, but I think surely in comparison to the efforts under Mao to try and do away with or destroy much of that cultural legacy, not true today. And there are obviously contradictions within that effort. But by and large, I think it's seen. I think it's understood that the attractiveness and the beauty and the great accomplishments of Chinese culture are potentially soft power elements for the leadership to take advantage of. So we do see that more. Yeah, in the book on Made in, I think I'm not an economist, and I tried to rely on as many of the really good ones that I respect in the field to make sense of what's happening in the Chinese economy today. And for me, it boils down to a productivity problem that with an aging society, with a dwindling workforce to support that aging society, with continued heavy reliance on investment-led growth models, with the trend lines appearing to take a downturn in terms of China's access to foreign capital, to foreign technology, even foreign markets, that this is putting an even bigger squeeze on the productivity outlook for China going forward, and that's the only way out of that. I think again, this is probably simplistic, but one of the principal ways to get out of that productivity challenge is to innovate, right? To get more return out of whatever investment you might make than you have in the past. And that's going to be a big challenge, I think, especially as these other, both domestic structural and international structural constraints increasingly come to bear on China. So Made in China 2025, I think, although we don't hear much about that anymore because there was such outcry in some of the international community, again, almost backfiring for China in putting that whole banner forward, is an effort to try and come to dominate and lead in these advanced technologies of the future, precisely to deal with the productivity challenge that China faces going forward. You mentioned India, didn't you, as well?
Yeah, the US and UK are they're trying to use India as a bid against China in terms of
I suppose,
technology.
I suppose people, yes, I think in a very crude sense, that may well be some of the geostrategic thinking. I think a lot of questions attend whether that's going to be successful or not. So I think we just have to wait and see. I don't think we should just take for granted that somehow betting on India is going to turn out in the right way, either in terms of India's own development or as a counterweight to China necessarily in the future. Just one very small example in all of that is the dilemma that India itself faces in its relationship, say, with Russia, right? And how it wants to play that in the wake of the Ukraine crisis and India's continued reliance and close relationship with Russia, at least especially in a military technical way. So I think we would be unwise to assume too quickly that somehow, we can bet on India as a counterweight for China. I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
Talking about Russia,
Yes,
I can't help myself
please,
but to
please.
ask a question.
Yes,
Um,
maybe you should answer the question you're going to ask.
Well, I just wanted to take up your invitation and push back on the point you made that Xi Jinping has not made any gains in foreign policy.
Except for one.
Okay. Is it in the case of Russia, we saw China achieve offshore oil and gas investments in areas that they were not, or oil and gas investments in general, in the Arctic, create the Polar Silk Road, could find some way of linking up the Belt and Road with Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. And both leaders have said their relationship has never been better.
Yeah.
I mean, one could
So
argue.
you're right. I should have said with some exceptions.
We could argue though whether this is good for China.
Right. Exactly. I was going to say to turn the last question around. How smart is China to bet on Russia as a counterweight to the United States? I'm not so sure, but you'd be the expert on that. Oh, but you're right. You could even ask, how good of a deal is this for Russia? Ultimately, it's a real question mark. And there'll be other examples. I mean, I think the China-Iran relationship has strengthened quite a bit in recent years. Probably the China-Saudi Arabia relationship is going to go better and better. So it's not across the board. I guess I was just trying to do a net assessment and also take seriously what Xi Jinping himself says about what he thinks the world looks like from Beijing, and it apparently doesn't look very good. And I wonder if he asked himself, now whose fault is that? I wonder, how did that happen? Anyway, all points well taken. And I'd love to hear more from you about whether you think this is a good bet or not on China's part.
Question, waiting with the microphone.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the great presentation. My name is Sherry, first year CPA student. My question is more on the Chinese domestic politics. So right now they're having a very high restriction on the public expression, not only on the politics, but on some social events that government failed to support or come to a resolution. So do you see this as a new form of cultural revolution? Or do you see any intention for Xi's administration to make it as a cultural revolution? And do you think that they're going to use the public voice as a leverage, potential leverage on their foreign policies?
Well, I don't think I'd want to liken it to a cultural revolution exactly, because of course that had a pretty specific political purpose as Mao intended it to unfold. Unless you're suggesting that Xi Jinping feels threatened, that his goals are not going to be pursued by the party, and that he has to appeal to the masses in order to overthrow his own party. I don't think I don't think where we are in China right now. And the effort to try and control speech in China, or to try to steer social activity and social expression away from criticism of the party, that's nothing particularly new, really, for almost any authoritarian regime to want to take those steps. And of course, it's always been the case that as social media has advanced, whether that's from the earliest days of the internet to now moving into the metasphere, it's almost always been the case that social organizations and individuals at first find ways to race ahead of government or of repressive authority within a given society. But history so far has suggested that with properly resourced, repressive regimes can usually get out in front of, eventually, on top of those forms of expression in ways that at least blunt that social expression's ability to undermine or threaten. Not always, but China has proven very adept. I should say the party has proven very adept at it so far. And I suspect that's going to continue. I don't know if that's answered your question very well, but
Yes, it does. And then, so you think that the government, sorry. So you think the government wouldn't use the public voice like against the other country as their potential leverage for the
I
foreign?
mean, maybe it's like stoking nationalism or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Well, that they already do. And so of course it's possible. I think the debate in the field is well, it's multifaceted. You know, there are different scholars who argue, you know, where does that impetus actually come from? Is it government induced? You know, is it the party that's seeking to invoke a greater degree of nationalism within their population in order to garner support? Or is it more of a grassroots? You know, it actually originates out of the society and sort of forces the party to take a more nationalistic position in order. Either way, I think it's fair to say that we are seeing a more nationalistic sentiment in China today than we've seen in the past. A colleague at the Center for China Analysis, a guy named Barclay Bram, has done some interesting work, especially within the youth population. And, you know, where this population has been coined, I think maybe it was a South China Morning Post journalist who said this, Generation N, referring to it being I think in their words, the most nationalistic generation in China, even though they're also the generation that is increasingly alienated, you know, involuted, and you know, taking to quote unquote lying down or lying flat. So while they might be unhappy with their individual lives and the directions that taken with 19% unemployment and you know, can't have children, or it's just too expensive to have children, life's getting more expensive, et cetera, et cetera. While your individual lives you might be dissatisfied, you may find some greater purpose or some greater connectivity in being proud of the nation, or even being, you know, forcefully proud of the nation. And it seems contradictory at first, but maybe not. And so this is an element of society that could surely be exploited and manipulated by the party if it wants to. But you know, I think they've learned that can often be a very dangerous and tricky balance to try and strike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gill, for a very interesting book talk. My name is Gustav Reinfeldt. I'm a SIPA student, originally from Sweden. And considering your own background in Sweden. Sorry? Mycket bra. And considering your own background in Sweden, you might know of the experiences that Sweden had with the wolf warrior diplomacy, and also possibly about Lithuania being a very strong and idealistic, some would say even activistic foreign policy voice within the EU and in relationship to China and to the situation in Xinjiang and with Huawei and so on and so on. And I was thinking, considering your point about maybe China revising its position on this wolf warrior diplomacy, and also this more polarized world, do you foresee that we will get more countries that will take this more idealistic activist foreign policy toward China in maybe similarly to Lithuania? And if so, do you think that China will again, well, move back into a more wolf warrior diplomacy and so on? Yes, thank you.
Well, I think you're right to identify that we seem to be in a, what I would think is a bit of a tactical retreat on the wolf warrior approach, because it has resulted in so much pushback, particularly in Europe, which I think is a part of the world that Beijing still hopes is in play, as it were, and it remains very important to China's future for a variety of reasons, economic and diplomatic, especially. So it could be that, and Xi Jinping himself has come forward and sort of laid down the law on wolf warrior diplomacy to say that cut it back and try to downplay it. So we may be entering a period that we won't be seeing it quite as vociferously. Now, of course, the COVID-19 situation really exacerbated, I think, what was already a tendency that was beginning within the Chinese diplomatic corps, and became a sort of, cause around which wolf warrior diplomacy could rally and push back against the criticism of China around the whole COVID-19 origin and so on. So I guess we'll probably, I suspect we'll see some pulling back from wolf warrior diplomacy, but if another situation were to arise that so directly affected the pride and national will and patriotism of China, I don't, as the COVID-19 and the criticism that it received for it internationally did, if another similar issue would arise in the international community, I don't think there'd be any hesitancy on the part of China's diplomats and others to push forcefully again, even in very offensive and sometimes very insulting ways, because again, this all has to do with the party having confidence in itself and demonstrating to their own people that China is not going to sit back and be bullied anymore. That message is, I think, pretty powerfully made clear that that's how China should comport itself internationally. So under the right circumstances, I think it'd be quite easy for wolf warrior diplomacy to come back.
Question with the woman on the screen. Yes. Sorry, I have a microphone. It's right there. As you point out, that both the giving and foreign policy have never been defined on the ground at the moment. At least from my own research, Matt, if you look at the context at the United Nations, I would argue that has been one of the great success. So I know you spoke to questions already about China-European relations, China-US relations at home. But I'd like to hear more about your thoughts about the way that China is reaching out and working with members of the world of China, especially on issues of real implementation, like the international research, exposing margins on areas of core research, right? Especially I'm very keen to hear where there's more on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. I think that would be enormous amount of work to be done to examine these questions in depth, and I suspect that if I can carve out the time to do it, I would love to lead a project that did this, because I think from a geostrategic point of view, Beijing has recognized that it has a great deal more to gain, a lot of leverage to be sought, and even some sort of diplomatic and political wins to be had by investing even more heavily in the global south. And I suspect we'll see more of it going forward. And mostly for the reason that you sort of suggested, that maybe they're going to find a greater degree of sympathy to some of China's views about how the world works. It's also the case that it's going to be very difficult in any near to medium term future to try and significantly improve relations with major advanced democratic powers, from Japan, South Korea, North America, Australia, New Zealand, much of Europe. And so that leaves, not very many doors there, but maybe still a lot of doors open for improvement. And of course, with the global south. And of course, maybe even, you take a look at the 12-point, what is it? What do they call it? The 12-point policy position paper on the political situation in Ukraine. Is that what it said? There are messages in there that I think are very resonate a lot, strongly with the interests of the global south. And in some ways that document, I think, was framed up with maybe not principally, but that audience very much, maybe Russia was the #1 audience they had in mind in writing that document. But I think also other members of the international community outside of the West, no doubt appreciated a lot of that wording about the need to be attuned to the issues of food security, the need to be attuned to the issues of sovereignty, and that the security of one country should not damage the security of another, and so on. So I guess the short answer to your question is yes, I think that there's a pretty serious effort underway, and the United Nations is a very important venue for that, to try and expand expand its influence and ability to operate with countries in the global south.
Did you have a question? Yeah, the microphone is. This might have to be the last question because our speaker has to leave.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. And I'm Brandon. I'm from China, actually, as you can see. Yes. Yes, I want to raise a question about China model. As you just mentioned, like a lot of China's growth or how economy works largely depends on its investment, or it's an investment-oriented economy. But a lot of questions actually centered on the population of China, as it had one of the largest population in the world. However, as you can see, with the aging population and also a lot of consensus or yields from the inside of China that we should raise the labor salary, and also like in other words, the labor costs should increase in an economic sense. However, another saying goes that China's growth largely depends on the economy of scales and the cheap labor costs, but its growth actually gets stagnated because of the low consumption compared to United States, in which like more than 50% of GDP is contributed by consumption. So under this kind of China model, which is investment oriented and depends on cheap labor costs and economy of scales, and with the low consumption phenomenon now, which stagnates the economy. So what do you think is the next move of China to achieve further growth, or what is the next version of China model that it's promoted by the party that we're gonna rejuvenate ourselves or things like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to defer to real economists to give you a better explanation, but I think, the formula is pretty clear as far as I understand it, and maybe I'm just too much of a Western mindset to know any different. But I mentioned innovation in order to increase productivity, so you're getting more value out of every dollar that you are investing. So that's going to require technological innovation and application to China's growth model. You need to deal with the population decline. So why not raise retirement age? That's to be very unpopular, but to maintain a larger labor force and to push off all the social benefits of retirement that people begin receiving today, at least in the state-owned sector, women at 55 years old. The French would be so jealous if they knew that, and so that would be another policy move you could make. It'd be very unpopular, but that's a very simple, I mean, at least on paper, a very simple way. And then, of course, incentivizing consumption growth and disincentivizing, heavy industry, statist, investment-led growth. Again, extremely difficult political decision to make. So, I mean, if the formula is there, the question, it's not an economic question, actually. These are all very much political questions, maybe with the exception of technological innovation. But even that means, people losing their jobs and, doing more with less labor. So all of these are political issues. And so far, Xi Jinping has shown no appetite, almost no appetite for wanting to go down that pathway. And even within the private sector that have shown how through the introduction of innovation and other, more progressive economic ideas, real success and wealth can be generated. And even some of those success stories have been, restrained. So formula's there, the political will is not.
On that
Thanks.
note, I think we have to thank Dr. Gill. Thank you to the audience for staying with us, and to the online audience. Apologies for technical difficulties. We hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much.